Hello everybody, my name is Gergely Rajnai. I'm the Hungarian Doctoral Fellow at the Wirth Institute at the University of Alberta, while I'm doing my PhD back home in Budapest at the Corvinus University of Budapest on political science. And the topic of my dissertation is the Consolidation of Power. And this includes a lot of practical, empirical research, but today I'm going to present the theoretical background of my research, which is what is the consolidation of power and what I understand when I'm talking about this subject. So in order to talk about this, first I had to define power itself, because power has a lot of different definitions in political science, but also in other social sciences. So my definition follows basically the instrumental power definition as proposed by Robert Dahl in the 50s and the pluralist school in political science. Instrumental power means that power means to have an ability to do something, an ability to influence policy in particular in politics. So if you have more power, then you have more influence in policy making. If you have less power, then you have less influence in policy making. It's a rather narrow definition of power, but it is very good for me because it's easy to operationalize. For example, if you have more people in parliament, more members of parliament in your party, then you have more power in this definition. So it's very clear when you have more power and when you don't, at least formally. And that allows me to describe and operationalize the consolidation of power much more easily than if I use another definition of power. If I use the wider definition of power, what is used in sociology or other schools of political science, then I would have a harder time to introduce my concept of the consolidation of power. And that's why I chose a narrower definition, and also because I like to do a lot of empirical research in addition to the theoretical introduction of the consolidation of power. So that's why I chose the instrumental power definition. So when I'm talking about the consolidation of power, I'm always talking about the consolidation of instrumental power, not others. But it could be adopted to other power definitions as well, but I'm using this one because it's the easiest for me. So in addition to me introducing this concept, this has been used for quite some time. I just have a different, particularly political understanding of it. So first of all, I need to clear up how I'm differing from other concepts that have the same name, the consolidation of power. So for example, in sociology, the consolidation of power is generally used as the consolidation of power by probably the state or maybe some other actor, but mostly the state, to penetrate civil society, to basically carry out actions that it couldn't do before. So when the state consolidates its power, then it becomes more powerful to do things for its citizens. So it's very similar to the other concept that is also called the consolidation of power, that is used in history when they are talking about the centralization of the state, of how states got more and more powerful from the Middle Ages on, and how we got to the current status of the state where it's a territorial entity that has power to carry out a lot of things for its citizens or against its citizens or some groups of its citizens. So that's basically the consolidation of power of a state or another, not an actor, but more of an entity. That's what in sociology and also in history, that's what they call the consolidation of power. My concept does not deal with an entity consolidating its power, not the state itself, but actors within the state or actors within another entity. So I'm talking about actors, justice in political science generally, and not entities like in sociology or certain schools of history. While within political science there are concepts that are very close to what I'm describing as the consolidation of power, but are not the same. They are somewhat different, and I thought introducing a new concept would be somewhat useful, especially for my dissertation. So, for example, there is the concept of the investment of power, which is a concept introduced by the School of Political Science that would like to draw parallels between economics and politics. So they adapt economic concepts and use it for political issues to describe them. So, for example, the investment of power is very similar to the consolidation of power. It would mean that somebody who is powerful today does not do everything within its power that it would like to do in order to have more power in the future. So let's say somebody is in government and would obviously like to favor its voters or even its own politicians or its own supporters as much as possible. So let's say somebody is elected with the help of let's say Big Pharma, then they would cut the taxes of Big Pharma and would also give them some subsidies from the state, whatnot. And that would be a use of power that is like within their means, but they would not do it because when they would do it, then the outrage would be so much, the backlash from the citizens, that they can expect to lose the next elections. So instead they decide to invest their power and not do as much for their own supporters as they would normally do, so that there is not much of an outrage, not much of a backlash, and they can continue on governing. This is a very similar concept to what I will describe as the consolidation of power. However, I think it's just one case of the consolidation of power. It can be a consolidation of power when power is invested in this sense, but it's not the only way to consolidate power. So my definition is broader than that. I don't think you have to restrain yourself in order to consolidate your power. That might be helpful, but it's not necessary. So that's how I differ from that concept. Then there is a concept called abusive constitutionalism, which has recently been used by legal scholars, and it's basically about changing constitutions or very important laws and legal frameworks in order to benefit the political actor that enacts that change. So basically, writing in the constitution things that would normally be a political, not a consensual political matter. So that is very, very debated. So let's say that, especially in the U.S., there is in state constitutions, a lot of state constitutions introduced the concept of it's unconstitutional to raise taxes, for example, or to raise specific types of taxes at the very least, and you have to change the constitution if you want to raise taxes. So that would be the idea, that it's very difficult to change a constitution. So basically, this abuses the constitutional principles, because constitution should only contain principles that have a consensus behind them and are not like smaller policy issues. So that's abusive constitutionalism, which is, I think, could be way to consolidate power, but also it's just one way to consolidate power. It's not the only way. You can do it without altering the constitution or without altering any laws even. You can certainly consolidate your power. So it is also a subset of the consolidation of power. And then there is a large literature from the past 20, 30 years in political science that deal with different types of democracy that are a little bit problematic because power is consolidated in there, or at least it is possible to consolidate power in them. So, for example, there is the concept of effective democracy, which would mean that it's an incomplete democracy. It has some issues. For example, there is an actor that is very difficult to move out of power. That would be a way to be defective in a democracy, and that would also be a way that actor would consolidate its power. So that's also one way to consolidate your power. Electoral authoritarianism is also similar when you have elections, but even though there is the elections have consequences, of course, but electoral authoritarianism can have two forms. One is when the leader cannot be really removed. There are elections, but the elections don't change too much because of how they are set up, or elections change a large deal, but once somebody is elected, they can basically be as authoritarian as they can be. There are no constraints on government. Either way, both are ways to consolidate power. There is also the concept of presidentialization, that is about certain individuals having more and more power in politics. Let's say we have concepts now like Trumpism in political science, whereas it's just a lot of power consolidated for one specific person or a group of persons maybe, but not for the party or not for an ideology. Like it's generally understood, especially in the pluralist school, it's generally understood that it's groups, large groups of society and parties that have power, not individuals that really have the power. And recently, presidentialization have occurred in basically every society, at least in the Western Hemisphere. I cited Trump, but you can cite Obama too. So even on the democratic side, it's, or any side basically on most political systems around the world, certain individuals have become more powerful than their parties that got them elected. So the individual, the importance of the individual has increased recently, and that can be an individual consolidation of power. So that can be a very similar concept to what I'm discussing. But these similar concepts all are just possible ways to consolidate power, and they don't describe the whole set of phenomena that I'm talking about. I actually have 4 requirements in order for consolidation of power to take place. First off, there has to be a consolidating actor, so again, not an institution or entity that possesses power, so it already is powerful. Somebody who doesn't have power cannot consolidate it because there is nothing to consolidate. So we are talking mostly parties, politicians in government that can consolidate the power. Parties in opposition or supporter groups have a harder time consolidating power because they have nothing to consolidate. Also, there is a deliberate action on behalf of this consolidating actor, so it's not an accident that this happens. They would have to have we would have to reasonably suspect that they want to consolidate their power, and that's why they are doing something. It's not just, okay, their power was consolidated because their opponents were so bad or they were just so popular because they were so competent. It has to be a deliberate aim to consolidate power. Also, during this deliberate action, the power that the consolidating actor has is used. So it's not just something that is done without or outside the scope of the power, but it's used. The actual power is used. So that's why in a lot of cases, a lot of instances, the consolidation of power is an abuse of power because it's using power, but not in order to do whatever was supposed to be done with that power, but it's used in order to consolidate that. And the fourth is the most important requirement, is that this action is aimed at increasing or preserving the power in the long run. Now, there's a lot to unpack in this short sentence, but the most important thing is that consolidation, in my definition, is about increasing power or just preserving it. in the long run, and in the long run can mean a lot of things. In most of my empirical research, I operationalize it as for more than one electoral cycle. So let's say for 4 years or more. That's in the long run, and we are not talking about something that increases somebody's power tomorrow, only tomorrow, and then 2 days later they are out of power because of that increase. That's not consolidation of power. Consolidation has an aspect of a longer time frame. That word has that connotation, and that's how I use it. So this is the most important definition in my dissertation, is that consolidation is about increasing or preserving power in the long run. So in order to describe this concept that I created in detail, I drew an analogy with democratic consolidation, which is a concept introduced in the 90s or maybe late 80s as new democracies came about in the world, in South America, then in Eastern Europe, and then all around the world, Africa, Asia, everywhere. More and more democracies came about in the 80s and 90s. That was the third wave of democratization, and during that, the political science literature came with the concept of democratic consolidation, which is, okay, we created a democracy, but that doesn't mean that it's not vulnerable, that doesn't mean that it's perfect, so these new democracies needed to be consolidated in order to say that they are stable and they are well functioning. So a lot of the political science literature focused on how consolidated these democracies were, how stable they were, and how well they functioned, and how much of or were they only just sceneries for continuing authoritarian rule. That's what the democratic consolidation literature really focused on. So the analogy that I drew with that is that both concepts, well, they have in their name that it's consolidation, but other than that, they are both teleological concepts, so they both are about achieving an end goal. So in power consolidation, that would be increasing power. That's the goal of the consolidating actor, to increase its power as much as possible. While in democratic consolidation, the consolidating actors have a goal of increasing democratic mass, basically the quality of them, increasing democratic stability or increasing the quality of democracy. So they are both similar that way. They want to increase or preserve something that is already there, so it's not something out of nothing, it's not establishing democracy or establishing power, it's something that is already established. We want to increase it or preserve it. That's the goal in both concepts. In one concept it's about democracy, in the other concept it's about the power of a certain political actor. So based on that, I created a typology of power consolidation, different types of power consolidation, that is based on an analogy that is the typology of democratic consolidation as created by Schadler in an article 20 years ago now. So here is the typology. It's a lot to unpack, and I will unpack it one by one. Just it's just an overview of what I will be talking about throughout the rest of the presentation. So the first type is negative consolidation. In the democratic consolidation literature, negative consolidation is defined as preventing democratic breakdown. So we already have a democracy. If it's negatively consolidated, it cannot disappear. So that's basically negative consolidation. Authoritarian rule just doesn't come back overnight if it's well consolidated negatively. In power consolidation terms, I'm talking about negative consolidation when somebody is aiming to preserve its power. A party, an actor, is aiming to preserve its power. So it's not about getting more power than it already has. It's just about, I have a certain amount of power. Let's say I'm in government, and all I want to do is stay in government. I don't want anything more than that. I just want to have what I have, what I already have. Just want to have that in the long run, as long as possible. So I have two subtypes of negative consolidation. One is the democratic one, which is the preservation of power. That's how I titled it. It's basically how democracy works. So there is somebody in government, and the reason that they want to enact good policies or popular policies at the very least is because they want to stay in government, right? They want to preserve their power as long as possible. If they weren't motivated to be re-elected, then they wouldn't be motivated to please the public, so they wouldn't be motivated to get more votes. So that's the whole idea of how an electoral democracy works. Is about the preservation of power. Every government has the goal of preserving power, and that can be done in a very democratic way, enacting good policy, creating a good campaign strategy, and whatnot. But it's all it can be a power consolidation. So there are examples of this. For example, social democrats in Sweden after World War II were in power until very recently, until basically mid-2000s. They were ruling Sweden democratically, but they weren't really challenged by any opposition because they were governing so that the public was really happy with them. And that was their goal, to remain in power as long as they could, and they had that, and they achieved that goal pretty well for a very long time. There is also the undemocratic subtype, which I call limiting competition, which is about somebody in government is trying to just stay in power, nothing more, but ensures by limiting the competition, limiting democratic principles, to remain in power, at least in part. So, for example, in Poland after 1990, the Communist Party managed to preserve its power by writing in the constitution there is a certain amount of seats reserved for them in the new parliament, even during the democratic elections. So even if nobody voted for the communists, they would have a certain amount of seats in the parliament. So they would preserve some of their power, and that was their goal. And they achieved that in 1990. Now they abolished that rule for the next elections, but that's not the point here. The point is that you can do it in a very undemocratic way, where it's like it's actually limiting democracy to stay in power, to ensure the preservation of power, to ensure negative consolidation of power. So this is the first column of my table, highlighted in red, about negative consolidation. You can see that there is a preservation of power and limiting competition. The aim is to preserve power that somebody already has. When the democratic way of preserving power is happening, it's mainly done by responsiveness to citizen or voter demands, and just good governance in general, or very good electoral governance at the very least, so that people are satisfied. While with limiting competition, we are talking about hindering opponents, at least to certain respects, in order to preserve power. So one is compatible with liberal democracy and the other one is not. That's as much for negative consolidation. The next type I'm talking about is positive consolidation, which in the democratic consolidation literature is talked about as improving or deepening democracy, so basically raising democratic quality. We already have a democracy, it's negatively consolidated hopefully, so it's not gonna just turn back into a dictatorship overnight, but we want to improve it. It's democracy, it's functioning, but especially people from Eastern Europe can relate. Democratic quality can be improved in a lot of different situations when it's just not perfect. It's not as well functioning as other democracies. So we want to improve or deepen democracy, have democracy penetrate more and more parts of society, etc. So that's what democratic consolidation talks about when they are defining positive consolidation. In my typology in power consolidation, it's about increasing long-term power. So somebody already has some amount of power, but the actor is not satisfied with the quantity of that power, so they want to increase it in the long term, and that's when they try to positively consolidate their own power. There are two subtypes here as well. The first would be deepening power. That would be somebody already has the power over a certain domain. So let's say a certain party controls the foreign policy of a government. Let's say it's a coalition government, and there is one party in charge of foreign policy. They are fine with having foreign policy when they are deepening it, but they want to have even more control of foreign policy. So they don't want the other coalition partners to say as much as they used to say about foreign policy. So that's deepening power, when you have power in a certain domain, but you want to increase your power within that domain, and that would be deepening power. On the other hand, extending power would be, you have power over certain domains, so you already have power over foreign policy if you are part of the coalition, but you want to take healthcare into your own hands too, and you never had a say in healthcare before, but if you want to have power in policy decisions about healthcare too, then you would extend your power to the healthcare domain as well. So that's the difference between deepening and extending power in my view. They are both positively consolidating, but one just increases power within a certain domain, so it increases the quantity of the power, while extending power increases the quality of the power. It basically gets you more ways where you are powerful. So these are often, but not always, linked with negative consolidation. So you might deepen your power or extend your power while not negatively consolidate, so not preserve your already existing power. So especially with extending power, that's possible. You have a total control of foreign policy and want to control healthcare, then you might give up some of your foreign policy power in order to extend your power to healthcare, and that would be a way when negative consolidation and positive consolidation are not linked. So, but in most cases, the two are linked. So first you preserve your power and then you deepen or extend it. So there are examples about this. For example, I'm talking about Belarus in the 1990s, but you can talk about other examples where Belarus was, where the president was quite constrained initially when they became independent, and then Alexander Lukashenko had more and more power. It would be an example of extending power to certain areas where the president didn't have power before, while in Latin American countries during their transition of democracy, there were some issues of the military deepening their power and just not relenting any control of the military decisions to civilian authorities as they did when the transition was happening. But soon after democracy was established, these military leaders would deepen their power within the military, and then they would sometimes extend their power to other more civilian and more political issues as well. But there could be other examples as well. So this is the second column of my table, positive consolidation. As you can see, the two subtypes. The aim is to increase power, not to defend it, not to reserve it, either in a domain where you already have power or extend to a domain where you never had power. And it could be compatible with liberal democracy, especially in fragile democracies. So, for example, in these Latin American examples, in other Latin American examples, there were issues where the military had too much control, and the civilian authorities extended their power to military matters in order to prevent a coup attempt or something like that. So that would be an example where positive consolidation actually fostered democracy, because democratic control was extended to places where it was not used before, but it was also a positively consolidating power for a certain actor that was in government at the time. So that would be compatible with democracy, but in most cases this is an anti-democratic, at least anti-liberal democratic move to consolidate power positively. Then there is neutral consolidation, which is in the democratic consolidation literature, it's about organizing democracy, making democracy ready for either positive or negative consolidation. It's an ever changing and ever present process that is basically it's just never ending. You always have to organize democracy. It's never perfect. And I think the same can be used to describe power consolidation. When power is adapted and organized, it's not really preserved and it's not really increased, but it's changed, adapted in order to in order to have it become to facilitate a negative consolidation attempt or a positive consolidation attempt. So it's basically preparation in this sense. So, for example, I use in my article the Hungarian example after 2010, when there were just so many different ways when the government adapted in how it approached certain situations. So first they would be concentrating on the IMF, and then when that didn't really work out, then they would concentrate on the EU, then they would concentrate on migrants. It's just adapting to the situations in order to preserve power. For example, that would be a very general idea of neutral consolidation, but I will talk about it a little more in detail when I'm talking about embedded power, because first off, there is the concept of embedded democracies, which is used by Merkel, and it's pretty similar to neutral consolidation, and I think it's quite useful to better understand what neutral consolidation really is. So the original concept is about that democracies don't just need to be consolidated, they need to be embedded to be enduring and to have a high quality. So they would have to have in certain frameworks within society or within the international system or within the economic society, it needs to be embedded. If it's not embedded, if international actors, if economic actors, if civil society is not on board with democracy, then it can be as consolidated institutionally as you want it to be. It's not going to be enduring and it's not going to be high quality. So that's the basic idea. And I do an analogy with power that if power is embedded, then it can be more enduring and it could be increased as well. So there are certain types of embedment or embeddedness. So first type is internal embedment. That would be in the power consolidation typology. It would be about making political institutions interdependent and dependent on the consolidating actors, so mostly on the governing party. So making more political institutions that are interdependent and cannot act without each other is a very effective way to embed your power, which doesn't necessarily increase the power, doesn't necessarily make it more stable, but it allows for both to happen at a later point in a consolidation attempt. So, for example, when in Nazi Germany, it's a very widely used example of power consolidation. One way that power was embedded was the parallel double or triple institutions for the same role, all dependent on the leader in that case. So, for example, the party had an institution, the government had an institution, the local government had an institution, and so on and so on, and they all were in charge of the same thing, and nobody knew who was really in charge. So whenever they needed to make a decision, they would have to be dependent on the actual leadership, the national leadership, when there was some conflict between these institutions, and that interdependent nature embedded the power of the Nazi Party early on. So this is the first column in the embedding power or neutral consolidation column, which is about making political institutions interdependent, and it's absolutely not compatible with liberal democracy, which is based on independent institutions. That's the whole idea of liberal democracy, that the institutions are independent and can check on each other and are not interdependent, and definitely not dependent on one leader, which is not necessarily part of internal embedment, but already if these different institutions are interdependent, so that could happen, for example, with the central bank or the economic departments of governments. When they become interdependent, that can become an issue for liberal democracy, and the more internal embedment there is, the more problems for liberal democracy. Then there is socioeconomic embedment, which would be integration of social or economic groups into the power structure. So, for example, there are certain groups that become quite reliant on that certain powerful actor that attempts consolidation. So, for example, the example I brought here was about was a pretty democratic attempt for the most part. Is about when in Central Europe there were the regime changes. The new regimes tried to do moderate reforms for the most part, and not these shock reforms in the economy. So they kept certain aspects of the policies that they inherited from communism, and only instituted moderate reforms so that there would be some benefits of market transition, but there wouldn't be all the downside. But this didn't really work out because most of these governments were not really popular, because there were a lot of issues throughout the transition period. So it didn't really work out, but that was the aim, to consolidate power, to have certain economic groups basically integrated their economic groups that were, in this case, benefiting from policies from the communist era. They didn't want them to be alienated from the government. That didn't really work out, but that was the idea of moderate reforms. But you can do more positive things when it's, you give all the subsidies to a certain social or economic group, and that will make them reliant on you, and they will be your reliable voters. That can be a democratic or, in certain cases, undemocratic thing, but this would certainly embed your power, would allow negative or positive consolidation to take place certainly in the future. So that is socioeconomic embedment, which is perfectly compatible with liberal democracy. For the most part, if it's very, very deep, and some social groups are even hindered by so much reliance on a certain political actor, then it can be against liberal democracy. But for the most part, this is a standard part of liberal democratic governance. Then there is international embedment, which is crucial. It's impediment to international environment, having an international environment that supports your power. So, for example, when countries were picking sides during the Cold War, they were expecting that that would increase the likelihood of them preserving their power or increase their power within their own countries. So, because if you don't have a powerful ally like the Soviet Union and the United States, then it's really, really difficult to function in the Cold War, and you have so many issues in foreign policy that you probably end up losing, not having enough focus on domestic issues, and then you can lose your place in the government. So that would be basically the issue here. So international support for your own government can be very, very important for later consolidation attempts. So yeah, so it's basically about gaining support from the international environment, and it's perfectly compatible with liberal democracy. In fact, liberal democracy cannot flourish without international embedment. If liberal democratic parties are not embedded internationally and there is no widespread international support for them, they will probably be very, very alone, and they will not be successful in competing with the local authoritarian parties that might gain support from other international actors. Finally, there is embedment in civil society, which would be integrating certain parts of civil society into the power structure. So, for example, in the case of the Catholic Church in Poland, which is a part of civil society and is very much linked with the power structure, with the current power structure. So there is, with the current governing party and even previous governing parties, for the most part, had a very good relationship with the Catholic Church, because they had to have a good relationship with the Catholic Church in order to gather enough votes to get into government. So that would be the whole idea, that in the power structure and civil society, at least part of civil society, are sort of interlinked. This could be very democratic when certain parts of civil society support a certain party, for example, and help them remain in power and increase their power. And this could be also very undemocratic when some parts of civil society are impaired or hindered if they are antagonistic of the government or the power structure in general. So, for example, I cite the example of NGOs in Hungary after 2010. There were certain NGOs that were opposing government, or at least the government perceived them to be antagonistic elements of society. So their support was cut, and the option to freely involve yourself in civil society is not guaranteed and is violated, and that would be against the liberal principles of liberal democracy. So yeah, this is the final type of embedding power, or neutral consolidation. So it also can prepare or positive or negative consolidation and organize and stabilize power, but it's while this is compatible with liberal democracy, in case of civil society is just helping a powerful actor, and there is just feedback from that parts of civil society, or it just helps campaigning and whatnot, that's fine. But once certain parts of civil society are excluded from the power structure completely and their activity is hindered, then that's not really compatible with liberal democracy. That subtype is not compatible, but in general, just the fact that the power structure engages with the civil society is not necessarily against liberal democracy. So yes, this is basically my concept of the consolidation of power. I have these three main types of it: negative, positive, and neutral, or embedding power. And that's the theoretical background of my dissertation. And what I do in the dissertation after the theoretical part is have empirical, or at least somewhat empirical research of certain examples or large-scale databases, and analyze data whether these consolidation attempts work or not in real life, or how effective they are in either negative, positive, or neutral consolidation. And that's basically how my dissertation is done, but this is just basically an introduction to the theoretical part of what I'm currently working on. So thank you very much for your attention, and yeah, see you next time.